Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com and welcome to my Object Masterclass. So this is going to be everything about JavaScript objects, or at least everything we can fit in about half hour. Okay, so basically a JavaScript object is every programming language generally has what's called a key value pair. So that means you label your variables inside of a larger collection with like more semantic names like strings, versus like an array where everything is in a set order and is labeled by an index, which is a number. And an object in JavaScript looks kind of like this. So const my obj equals, and then you use curly brackets. So curly brackets always mean object, and everything in JavaScript is an object because it uses what's called prototypes, which we'll come back to. Okay, so my object, and then you just put key value pairs. So you would put the key, which is the name, we'll say name, colon, and then my name, Alex. Then I put a comma and put in another key, which we'll say is my age, and then that'll be 34. And you can put any kind of items I want. Okay, so I could say, I could put an array in here. So I could put, an array called milestone, so like milestone ages in my life. And we could say 18 or 10, 13, 18, 21, 30. So I have this array inside my object. Okay, you could also put functions. I'm going to come back to that because that's kind of a discussion on it to itself. But see, there, I've created an object. It's a new object. Okay. And now if I want to access these objects, so just to show, I go console.log, I just type in my obj, and I use dot notation. So I do my obj dot name, which just means in my my object, look for a property called name. And you'll notice you use this dot notation for a lot of other stuff. It's because everything's an object. An array is an object with a bunch of properties. Strings are objects with a bunch of properties that are built into JavaScript, because they have a particular prototype, and I'll keep kind of mentioning that. Okay, so my obj dot name. So I'm accessing that property. Now if I hit save, see, I got Alex. Now if I did my obj dot age, save, 34. Okay, if I did my obj dot milestone, it prints out the array. And if I just console log the whole object, I just get this. There you go. I get the full, you get to see the full array. Very neat. Now notice you don't see like any kind of word right next to the object, because this object has no prototype. It's just a pure object. It's an object type object. Now the reason why that matters is because basically the way JavaScript handles inheritance is that objects can have what's called a prototype, which just means it's another object that it refers to. So what I could do is, like, let's say I wanted to create another object. Const my obj2 equals, and we'll just say another property. This is just called hair. We'll say my hair is black. But I want my object2 to have access to all these other properties. Then I can just do this. My obj, I think it's dot set prototype. Now I'll quickly look up if that doesn't work. Should be set prototype of, I think it's set prototype of. And then you can put another object here, and it'll set that object as its prototype. So actually, let me do my object2 here. Okay, and it's going to set this as its prototype, and I'm going to console log my obj2 for a second. Save. Let's see if all this works. There, set prototype of is not a function. Okay, rewrite back. Okay, so the function name is right. I just used it wrong. So let me delete this, because basically the way it works is this. I'm going to do const my obj2, and the set prototype of function is actually not a function of an individual object. It's a static function of all objects. So I have to do this: object dot set prototype of. I'm going to say my object will be the prototype. Let me just double check, make sure that I'm doing that right. Oh, okay. Nope. First, we want to do the empty object. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm saying I want to create a new empty 0 prototype object. So that's what that represents, a new object. And then here's the prototype. So my prototype will be my obj. Okay, and then here will be stored a object that has the prototype of my obj. And then afterwards, if I want, I can assign the property hair. So in the way you would create a new property when there isn't one, I would just do my obj.hair equals black. So let's play with this for a second. So if I do node functions.js, I console log my obj2, and it's just an empty function. Oh, because I didn't. This should be my obj2. Save. So it's an empty. Well, it's not empty anymore. It's an object with just one property here, because it's the only property that I specifically gave it. But we assigned my obj as a prototype. So if I were to do something like this, my obj2.name. See, my obj2 doesn't have a name property. It just doesn't. But since it has a prototype, whenever it doesn't have a property that I refer to, JavaScript goes, let me see if it has a prototype. The prototype is my obj. So it's then going to look at that object and see if that property exists, which it does, name, and it should return Alex. Alex, cool. So when you're using classes and inheritance in JavaScript, it's really just an abstraction over this, okay? So technically you've had this functionality before classes existed in JavaScript. It was just through prototypes. But in every other programming language, you do the same thing through classes. So JavaScript introduced classes to give people a more intuitive way to be working with prototypes. So you never really need to work with prototypes like I just did here. It's just all built in, and classes and inheritance kind of do all that for you. But just so you know, under the hood, everything is this. So when you create an array, notice all those functions that array has. It's because it's referring some array prototype that exists in JavaScript that has all those functions already built in, those function properties. So when I say that everything in JavaScript is an object, I mean everything in JavaScript is an object. And again, just to summarize, a prototype is just saying this object refers to this object. So if this object doesn't have it, go check with them. It's kind of like a cosigner on a loan. If they don't have the money to pay, go check the cosigner. That's all it is. So I'm just saying we're creating an empty object with the prototype or cosigner of my obj. So now you know what a prototype is. You probably won't ever have to work directly with prototypes or have to worry about prototypes. But now you understand when you look at like stuff like this, object, or sometimes you'll see like object.prototype of, or object.prototype. When you look at documentation, you see that referring to this, there's this imaginary master version of everything in JavaScript that exists, that has all the properties, that has all the array properties, that has all the object properties, that has all the string properties. So there's an object version of each one. Whew, that's always a tricky thing. Okay, so moving on. Now another way you can create a new object, so this is actually another way you can create an object. You could just do this whole set prototype thing of, but another way, let's go back over here, const my obj, just kind of like with arrays, had the new, because again, everything is an object and all objects can be substantiated like this. I could just be like new object, and if I were to console log my obj, save, see, it's just an empty object. Okay, so you could do that and you can pass values in here. Okay, and I think you would pass them. Let me check here. Let's see here. If I pass it as, I think I might have to pass them as like an array of arrays. So it would be like age 34. If I do that, does that give me what I think it's going to give me? Yep. Well, no, not exactly. It just gave me an array with an array. So that didn't quite return what I thought it would return. Yeah, it just seems like, yeah, you can't really pass anything into here. If you do an object this way, you create an empty object first and then you assign the properties. So in that case, basically, if I wanted to add some properties to this empty object, again, there's two ways to do it. I've showed you one so far. You just do my obj and use dot notation and just create a property. Property 1 equals 5. But another way you could do it is you use square brackets. So if I do this, instead of a dot, I'm just going to put square brackets, and then I can put the key in here as a string. That is the same thing. And the cool thing about doing it this way is that now you can use spaces. So here it was like my property is the key now, and I actually have a space in my property. Equals 6. Now if I console log my object, see here, property 1, key 5, my property 6, and it realizes that this is the key. But from now on, if I ever want to access it again, I have to use the square brackets. My property, cool. And then if I do that, save, say it gets me 6, which is what my property was worth. And I could actually access property 1 with this too. So I can just type in property 1, and it should give me the 5. Ta-da! Huzzah! Cool. Now a neat trick with this is, with this syntax, I can actually dynamically name object properties. Because maybe I'm looping through something and I'm creating properties on the fly, and you know, if I'm doing this, I have to know the name ahead of time. But let's say I wanted to do this. I created like, you know, let's say username, or username const username equals the string Alex. Now I could do something like this. I can use backticks and say, you know, username property. Okay, and I can use a variable to build out my property names, and use interpolation to dynamically, so you might have like a counter, so that way you're not constantly, you're never overwriting a property, you're just adding a property, because every time you use it, it adds 1 to it or something. So I hit save. Let's just console log my obj. I've only found, I've had to use this once. It was actually pretty helpful in a particular situation, because I was dealing with online API data, and I didn't know how many entries there were going to be, how many properties there were going to be. So I was able to actually like dynamically pull the data in, generate the properties and it worked. It did the job. It was mainly for like DOM manipulation, because I had to create like an extra modal for a whole bunch of different entries, and I need to figure out what I'm going to call those modals, and all sorts of cool stuff. Node function.js. If I run this, there you go. So you see Alex property 6, and the reason it goes back to, like, see, since there's no space, it goes back to not having to show a string and make it green like it did earlier. It just shows it like normal. But you can dynamically like create property names, which is pretty cool. Okay, so we're kind of moving along. Now looping over objects. Okay, so let's first create another object. Const my obj equals, we'll just do it this way. Name Alex, age 34, email. No. That's fine. Now the most basic way of iterating over an object. Now the problem with iterating over an object is you don't know what order it might do age first, it might do name first. Objects aren't ordered, so in certain situations that might be a problem. If you don't really care what order it gets iterated over, then this is fine. It's called a for in loop. So it'd be like for key in my obj. Because the way it works is it loops over the keys. So first it's going to go key name, then it's going to do key age, and then I can just console.log my obj. And since I don't know exactly what key is being passed in, I'm going to use the square brackets and pass in the key as a variable to be the key. So that's another place where that square bracket notation comes really useful when you're dynamically choosing keys. So then I do that, and see, it console logs my two values. Now the other way you can loop over an object is by turning it into an array first, and then just looping over it like you would loop over an array. So I won't get into looping over arrays, but I will show you how you turn an object into an array. There are 3 functions for this, and they're all static functions, meaning they're not functions of your individual object, they are functions of the object prototype. So object dot well, first we need to store these, so we'll say const keys equals object dot keys my obj. So what this function does is going to take this object and make an array of the keys. So it'll be like name, age, and then const values equals object dot values my obj. This will take the values of an object, so Alex34, and make that an array. And then const entries equals object dot entries my obj. Okay, and this is just going to take that object and break it down to an array of arrays, where it takes each array and turns it into a key value pair. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So let's console.log keys, console.log values, and console.log entries. Okie dokie. Now, neat. Okay, so let's play that out and see. The first keys gave me an array of the keys, and then I can just iterate over that array. So I can just do a for loop, or for each, whatever. And then the second one, the values, gave me an array of the values, and then entries gave me an array of arrays, where each array is the key value pair. Cool. So that's stuff. So I can use those to loop over the object as well, which is pretty useful. Cool. Now let's talk about destructuring. Okay, so now if I wanted to assign these two properties of my obj to separate variables, I'd have to do this. Const name equals my obj dot name, const age equals my obj dot age, and now I can console.log name and age. See, Alex and 34. But that's a lot of typing. I could do this all in one line using a tool in JavaScript called destructuring, which is so one of my favorite things in JavaScript. And the way that works is you do curly brackets. This tells JavaScript you're breaking down an object. So you're taking in something that's put together and breaking into pieces. That's why it's called destructuring. You're destructuring it. So I want name and age. So I have two new variables called name and age, and they're going to equal the values inside the myObj. So the way this works is it's going to look inside this object, look for a property called name, and then store it here. It's going to look for then it's going to look for a property called age, store it in here. That's pretty cool. Now, when it does that, let's see here. I should end up with the same result, but that's a lot less typing. Alex 34. Neat. And let's say I don't want them to have the same name. So maybe I want the name property from my object, but I want to call it something else. I want to call it Alex. Okay. You just do that. So it's going to pull the name property from my object and store it in a variable called Alex. Okay, and then I just do this. Save. And see, I end up in the same place, Alex 34. So destructuring is pretty neat. Okay, that's a very useful trick. This can also be used to pull something out of an array or out of an object. So let's say I had a couple other properties in here like hair black. Okay, and I want to take that out. I want to take out the hair property out of this object. So how would I do that? Okay, what I would do is I would do const. We'll say hair, because I want to pull that out, because the destructure will break that piece off and store it in hair. And then I want the remainder of the object stored in a new object called myObj2. So this means the rest. So this is called the rest operator in this context. It could also be referred to the spread operator in other contexts, which I'll show you as well. But this grabs the rest of the object, stores it in myObj2, and again, where are we pulling this from? myObj. So when I console.log myObj2, I hit save, I run the thing, and see, now I have an object without hair. Because I pulled the hair, I was able to pull the hair out by saying we're going to destructure hair, and then we're going to put the rest in myObj2. And now I have an object without the hair property. Okay? Because again, that original myObj has the hair property. Okay? So that's a neat trick. Now let's talk about combining objects. Okay, so let me take the hair property out of here. Const myObj2 equals hair black, eyes brown. Okay, now I want to combine these two objects. Let's try a couple different things. First, let's do const myObj3, the combined object, and we'll say it equals myObj1 plus myObj2. Let's see what the result of that is. Well, we got to console log it so you can see it. Console.log myObj3. So if I put that here, and I get a error. Obj1 is not a function. When did I use it as a function? Oh, I see. It's just myObj. Save. And it just gives me two objects. Okay, so that's not useful. Okay, that's not the result I wanted. So that's not going to work. So then next, maybe what we need to do is wrap these in an object. If I do that, and then I would just do this. Okay, and this would be the key. Well, actually no, I'll just do it that way. And here's just a neat trick about objects. If you plop a property, a variable into an object, and you don't do this whole colon thing, it'll just treat the variable name as the key and the value as the value. It'll just do that for you. Okay, so if you're looking for it to have the same name and value as the variable you're passing in, you could just plop the variable in just like I did here. So let's see what I end up with. So now I end up with an object with two objects inside of it. See, my obj is the key, and the value of the myObj property is the object that was in that variable. Okay, but that's not what I wanted. I didn't want two objects inside of an object. I want one object with all four properties. So this is where the spread operator comes into play. You would just put in dot 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 dot, and this spreads the object inside the new object. So now when I save it and I run it, huzzah, one nice big object. Okay, so that's how you combine objects. So we know how to pull stuff out and all sorts of fun stuff with object. Last thing is putting functions inside objects, because there's technically 3 ways to add a function to an object. Okay, so const myObj equals the first way. So we'll just call this func1. Is you just do it like normal, except you use like a arrow function. So I would just pass in this arrow function here, because again, a function is just a value. So you can treat this as a value I'm assigning to this key. And this, I'm just going to say console.log I'm function1. And there we go. Now we have that function. Put a comma, because we're going to make another property. Here's func2. Here I use the function keyword. Then I put parentheses. And then put curly brackets. And say console.log I am function2. Then I put a comma on that one. And then the third one is the oddest one, probably the oldest one, is you just define a function randomly right there smack dab in the middle of your object like this. Function func3 okay, curly brackets. So it's like the same thing as the second version, except the key is kind of implied. So it's implied that this is going to be the key. You're not explicitly saying it's the key like I did here. Okay, and then this will be console.log I am function3. Save. Okay, neat. Now if I then go down here and try to invoke all 3 functions, so my obj dot func1, I'll just copy and paste this. Func2, so I'm just using a function that's inside my object. Func3. And I get a syntax error. Unexpected identifier, func3. Let me think about that for a second. Actually I don't need the function keyword in this scenario. You can just do func3 like that, and then that would do the trick. It'll just know it's a function because of the curly brackets and the parentheses. So let's run that again. Let me get rid of this thing down here. And you see all 3 functions run. So I wrote all 3 of these functions in completely different syntax. First one was a key and an arrow function. The second one was a key and old school function. And then the third one is an old school function where I explicitly name the function. You know, instead of matching it to a key, so it just takes the name of the function as the key, and it works. It all works. There are some distinctions between like using these versus the arrow function. I personally like the arrow function. It solves more problems than it causes, versus these two, where I think it creates more problems than it solves. The benefits of using these functions is, one, you have access to this thing called the arguments object. And just to show you what I mean, let's say I just put in like, actually I'm not going to even get into the arguments object. It's a thing, you search for it, it's rarely useful anymore because there's so many libraries that already kind of do all the things you would use it for. But there is a difference between how this keyword goes. So let me actually give you an example. Let's add a property called name Alex. So this object is also going to have a property name. That's just my name. Put a comma there. And I want to show you what happens if I try the console log this.name. Okay, so now this refers to, this in JavaScript is really weird. It always refers to the object that invokes the function. Okay, so whatever object ran the function. So this always gets really funky when you're using like button events with the DOM, because the button is the one that's actually technically calling the function. So then it suddenly thinks that this is the button, even though you meant some object to be this. So this is why the arrow functions are really nice, because it binds this to the object. And that's sort of like the number one reason why you should always use arrow functions, so that we don't have to worry about binding stuff. Which when you work with like React is a yay. Cool. Let me just save that. And I'm going to put that in all three of these. If I remember right, this should behave differently. Like I think just for like a standalone object like this, I don't think that should work for the arrow function. It will work for the other two. Let me just see if I'm right. Okay. And yes, I am right. So see, in the arrow function, in a standalone object like this, this becomes useless. Okay, this keyword dies. So when I say this.name, it doesn't see that this object has a property named Alex. It doesn't know what this is. So I'd have to do like my obj.name. Okay, while when I use the older school functions, this then becomes the object. But again, then if I use it for like these functions for like a click event on a HTML button, things get really complicated, which they don't when I'm using the arrow function. So that's just, again, a little not quite object stuff, but useful stuff to know, to be aware of. So just know that you can use the this keyword with these two function syntax. You can't use the this keyword with this syntax when constructing an object. Although it's a fairly easy to work around, but this is why generally when you're building like classes, you'll generally use these types of functions so that we have access to that this keyword, because the this keyword is much more important when you're building classes, because you're going to be instantiating all these different versions of a class, and you want to make sure that they have access to those properties. So just a little advanced dropping of knowledge. But I think at this point you've kind of learned everything you would need to know as far as working with objects, as far as like what can be held in them, how can I tear them up into pieces, how can I combine them, what are different ways for me to use a notation, different ways for me to create them. This was a nice masterclass in objects. So I'll see you guys later. You guys have a great day and enjoy.